Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to go over the ancient Greek imperfect tense. So far, we have been working with the present and the future tense. Both of them have the same endings, and it's just the stem that's changing. And now we're actually going to be talking about the past, one of the first past tenses. So we have two past tenses in Greek, the imperfect and the aorist. And in the case of the imperfect is actually made from the present stem. And so we're going to be talking about how does that happen. So let's first review some of the basic issues about verbs. Right? So verbs have 5 aspects we talk about: their person, their number, their voice, mood, and tense and aspect. So we're going to focus today on tense and aspect. All right, so verbs then can be actions and states. So I can be hitting the ball, or I can be awake. So we have a state, I'm awake, versus I'm actually doing an action, I'm running, I'm hitting a ball, etc. So actions, there's actions and there are states. Both of them, verbs cover both of them, and they can be in the different tenses. You can have a past tense, I was running, present tense, I am running, future tense, I will run, right? And you can also be in the state. So I was awake, I am awake, I will be awake. So the tenses work. It doesn't matter whether it's an action or a state. And aspect is a little trickier because we don't really think about it so much in English, because we actually express it explicitly with a different form of the verb. So aspect has to do with whether or not the verb, the action, or the state is completed or not completed, whether it's a customary kind of action or a single specific occurrence, whether it's a general situation, general action, or a specific instance, etc. So there are these different kinds of sort of nuances about actions that aspect captures. Here's a list of verbs that Mastronardi provides that sort of gets at the idea of aspect when it comes to a verb. So you have the same verb, but then in English we translate it where it's clear in English through the different word how the aspect is. So we have seek, which is a longer action, like I'm seeking takes some time, where finding is more instantaneous. Looking versus perceiving and seeing something. Believing versus realizing and learning something. To go or to travel, or versus arriving and departing. Urging versus persuading and convincing. To be versus to become. To cry, to burst into tears, and to be dying, or to die. So you can see there's the same idea, same verb, but the duration or the quality of the action is different depending on the phrasing that we're using in English. All right. So what about the present tense aspect? Because the present system, our first principal part is the present system. The second principal part is the future system. The third principal part is the aorist system, and the fourth principal part is also the aorist system. We have the aorist active and the aorist passive. And then the last two that we're not really memorizing are the perfect system. And they're actually organized not so much by tense, though it predominantly is by tense, but actually by aspect. In the finite forms, the tense and aspect map on very closely to each other. But once we move out of the indicative and we move into other moods, say the subjunctive or the infinitive or something like that, then the aspect of that system dominates, because there is no temporal aspect to those. There's no tense to the subjunctive, etc., or the tense is obvious, and it's the aspect that matters. So what then is this, right? Well, the present tense stem has the action, or sort of has the aspect where the action is not yet completed. It's ongoing, it's in progress, perhaps repeated, customary, or pertaining to a general truth, as Master Nardi points out. So it's ongoing, undone. Any kind of durative kind of action is going to be related to the present stem. In the case of the aorist, the actions are going to be completed quickly. There's instantaneous action, done actions that are done as soon as they occur. So it's a different kind of action. And you can see how, because the actions are of this kind of instantaneously done, then they tend to be in the finite form, tend to be in the past tense. Okay, but what does it mean then to have a past tense in the present system, right? And this is where the imperfect comes in. It's called imperfect, drawing from Latin terminology, meaning that it's not done, or it's slowly completed or progressively completed over time in the past, right? So there's a difference between an action that happens one time, action that happens instantaneously, versus an action that takes some time to complete in the past, ongoing action in the past. And a lot of Romance languages have imperfects, and it's more or less maps onto that, where it's incomplete action in the past or ongoing action in the past. All right. So here's some examples from the Greek, and we can see what's happening. So here's the present tense with the present aspect emphasized in how I'm translating it. So tau talego, I am speaking, or I am saying these things, right? The action is ongoing, in progress. Petho, I am urging. So in English, we actually would say I am urging, in the sense that I am doing it and haven't really convinced anybody of anything yet. So I'm actually pressuring somebody. So I am urging. That's when the present aspect is emphasized. Polakis dora, polakis dora ferro. I often bring gifts. That is in a repeated action, right? I'm bringing gifts very frequently. Hoi barbaroi tois patrasi pethontai. So the foreigners obey their parents. Hoi barbaroi tois patrasi pethontai. The foreigners obey their parents. So this idea is that they do it all the time. It's a customary action. Hosophos tein alethean zete. So the wise man seeks the truth, always. He's always seeking the truth, pursues the truth. So this is, again, a general truth. So again, we're using the present stem, captures that. Here's another one. Tau tatoi stratiotais didomi. So here I give, or I'm offering the soldiers these things. So I haven't handed it over yet, but I'm in the process of giving it to them. There you go. So the context, in the present tense, the context will dictate how you would translate it. Whether it's I give it to him, or I am giving it to him, I do give it to him, I offer it, I try to give it. that's going to be present tense. In but past tense, so as I said, we have two past tenses precisely because the aspects are going to be expressed in these two tenses. And so the first tense that we meet, past tense that we meet, is the imperfect, where the aspect of the present stem, that is this continuous, progressive, ongoing action, attempted actions, is expressed in that form. So, as I said, this is also going to be shown in other, it's like more obvious when you get to the other forms, like infinitive and imperatives, participles, subjunctives, optatives. Once we look into them, we'll see that, yeah, that's what's being, why we're choosing to use that, the present version versus the aorist version is precisely because we're trying to capture aspect. Okay, here is the system, the present system charts for the verb to give, didomi, one of our mi-verbs. And here we can see then that the present system, this is the full present system, all the aspects, all the parts of the verb from the present system. And so we can see we have the indicative, which is the finite form. I give, I am giving, it's the actual action. Then you have the subjunctive, which I said we're not going to get into, but its subjunctives tend to be potentials. So I could give. Optatives tend to express wishes. I would give, I would like to give, or may I give, something like that. But again, we're not going to deal with those. But the imperative we do look at. So so keep giving or offer it would be the present imperative here, to give, because the idea needs to be a progressive action. When we learn the aorist, we'll see that give it to him as one action, that would be the aorist. What here, the present system, didu, means offer it to him. Give it to him in a sense of, be in the process of doing it ongoing, something like that. But then we notice every system, present system has the imperfect as well. So this is the past tense, what we call the secondary system in the present system. So you've got a primary, which is the present and present tense, and then the secondary, which would be past tense. So here, how you're going to tell the difference between the present and the imperfect is, of course, going to have to do with the endings and what you're going to do with how the verb looks. So here is an example. We have hoi politai agathoi enai bulanta. Here's an example of the present system with the infinitive. And so the citizens want, that's bulontai, to be brave, enai agathoi, right? So on all occasions, in general, they want to be brave. So there it is again. It's a general action. Here it is. It's difficult to be in exile, right? So ta kalapon, ta fugain. Ta fugain is the infinitive with the article, the being in exile, the state of being in exile, is difficult. It's a lasting state. It's difficult. And here is the imperatives. Always praise worthy men, right? So aye epainete tus axius. Always praise worthy men. So usually, you'd get something like aye, always, and you pretty much would expect then that the imperative would probably be in the present imperative because of the nature of the word always, right? Me potese te aiskran hedone. Never seek a shameful pleasure. Again, just as aye and me pote are opposites, right? Always and never, they do have this sort of long-standing, always going on situation, but never seek a shameful pleasure. So again, you'd use always and never, would more likely follow with a present imperative here. Okay. All right, so let's now zoom in on the imperfect. as I said. So the imperfect is part of this present system, even though it's a past tense. So don't get fooled by the name of the system, which is present, and the fact that the imperfect is a past tense, because the present system really refers to this idea of aspect, which is that it is this undone continuous action, that kind of thing. That's what present means here. Okay. All right. So the imperfect then is a branch of the present system. And you use, in order to form the tense, you use the present stem. So if you notice in that chart, all the forms that were there were all coming off of the present stem. All right, so what do we get when we have an imperfect? Well, tauta elegon. So before we had tauta lego, I am speaking these things. Tauta elegon. I was speaking these things. I was saying these things at a particular time in the past, but it's ongoing. Or I kept saying these things, right? But notice, I was saying, not I said. Okay, there's a difference. I said would be an instantaneous one-time occurrence versus I was saying. It took me a couple of hours maybe to get through the whole presentation. I was saying these things. Epithon. So we had patho before. I am urging. Here it is, I was persuading. I was, trying to persuade them. I was in a process of persuading. Imperfect. Polakis dora eferon. Before it was Polakis dora fero. I often bring gifts in the present. Now I often brought gifts in the past. Again, repeated action. Oi barbaroi tois patrasi epithonto. Now we move to the imperfect. So the foreigners obeyed their fathers always, or it was part of their custom that they obeyed their fathers. Ekhastote ton strategon ulegon. So each time, on every occasion, ekhastote, every time, they used to, or they did, they praised their general. So ulegon, to praise, right? Or they were praising their general, always doing it, or in the process of doing it in the past. Okay, so ongoing action in the past, customary action, repeated action, incompleted action in the past, you're going to use the imperfect because if that's the ongoing action is the aspect of the present system. So here, tau tatoi stratiotais didomi. Again, I give or I offer the soldiers these things, and then in the imperfect, tau tatoi stratiotais edidun. I was giving or offering the soldiers these things. Well, let's go back to, of course, our irregular verbs. I always like to start with the irregular verbs to get more exposure to them because they are the most common verbs and they just have to be memorized. There's no pattern to them for the most part, right? And so we start off with our irregular mi-verbs, and I've been encouraging you to learn your mi-verbs with their corresponding infinitive because that helps you deal with the present system of the mi-verbs, because that's where the mi-verbs are off the rails, is in the present system. That's where they differ from the omega verbs. All right, so let's look. So we get, this is the present. So Amy, a, esti, esmen, esta, ac, I am, Amy, AC, emen, ita, iasi, I go, or I will go. Fami, face, facey, famen, fate, fasi, I say. So those are the me verbs, the irregular ones. Just have to memorize them. So needless to say, they're in the imperfect, they're also going to be irregular, and therefore you need to memorize them. So in the case of Amy to be, Amy becomes a or ein. A, you are, becomes esta. And we've seen that kind of sta ending with oida, right? It was oida, oista. So that sta ending is an alternate second person ending. But anyway, esta, esti, ein, esmen, amen, esta, eta, or esta, and AC, asan. Okay, so this is, you just have to memorize it. There's really no pattern to it. Just gotta memorize it. But this is I was. Okay. All right, so Amy to go in the imperfect, then you go from Amy, I go, to Aya, I was going, or Ayen, I was going. A goes to Aesta, or Aes, you're going. AC becomes Aen, Aa, he was going. Emen becomes Amen, so we were going. Ita becomes Eta, y'all were going. Easi becomes Easan, or Asan with Easan, they were going. Okay, so that's your verb to go, irregular, needs to be memorized, no way around it. And then fami, again, a little bit irregular too. So it's fami, effain, face, become, so that Amy, effain means I was saying. Efface, effaista, or efface, so you are saying. AC, fa, he was saying. Famen, efamen, we were saying. Fate, efate, y'all were saying. Fasi, efasan, they were saying. All right, so these are the irregular me verbs in the imperfect. You just got to memorize them. There's no way around it. All right. Now, there are, of course, some irregular omega verbs as well. And here we definitely need to memorize these, again, because they're super common. And so to have echo, exo, or skeso, eskon, escathane, these, this is in our list, this in our second unit, it is irregular. And so it has echon, eches, eche, echomen, ekete, econ. And we'll see the way in which it is irregular has to do with how that it begins, with the way in which it we'll see in a second that the verbs have a marker at the beginning of the word that tells you you're dealing with a secondary past tense verb, and how this one actually makes that marker is weird, and so that's why it's actually irregular. Because usually, if a verb is regular, you can figure out how it will be marked as a past tense by looking at your third principal part. So in this one, you can see echo, and then exo or skeso is the second principal part, that's the future. And then the third principal part, which is the aorist, which I said is also in the finite form of past tense, it has the past tense marker, which we call augment, on it. So it should have right? That's what's going on, but it doesn't. So it's irregular. All right, so you just have to memorize it. And another one that needs to be memorized is horao. I always am sad that horao, one of the first verbs that we learn in Greek in this class, is also one of the first verbs to go off the rails. Before we even get out of the present system, it's already off the rails. So yeah, horao, we can see it has two augments, and we'll see what that is in a second, but it has two of them. Instead of doing one or the other, there's two ways to do the augments. You have the or you lengthen the vowel. It does both. So we see with horao, it becomes he ora on, right? So it becomes heron. But we'll come to that in a minute. But the point is that, yeah, you got to memorize hora as well. So he oron, he oras, he ora, he oromen, he orate, he horon. All right, so that's going to needs to be memorized as well. All right, so what are the general principles then of forming the imperfect tense? How did we get those forms? Now, the imperfect is going to come from the present system, so it's going to have the present stem using the same stem that we see in the present tense, that is. So the difference between the imperfect and the present will be the kind of personal endings that they will have. So the present tense has present tense endings, imperfect has imperfect endings, past tense endings. And the imperfect is also marked with an augment. So in terms of how the steps go, step one, you generate your present stem. So if it's an omega verb, you knock off the omega, and that gives you your stem. So with balo, you knock off the omega, you get bal. And with mi-verbs, you knock off the mi to give you the singular in the stem, and you knock off the nai in the infinitive to give you the plural and the general stem of the rest of the forms, right? Okay. But what is an augment? That's our next issue. So the augment is what is going to go ahead, and that's going to be a reinforcing marker to make sure that we know that we are in the past tense. Because some of the forms we'll see could be mistaken for present tense without the augment, because of the fact that we're coming from that present system. Some of the endings are the same in the imperfect and the present, and so without the augment, you can't tell which one it is. So you need the augment. So then in step 2, we add the augment. Now the augment can come in two forms. The first form, we call that the syllabic augment, and that usually goes on the verb if it has a consonant at the beginning of the stem. Or if it begins with a vowel, then we call it a temporal augment. And we do that by lengthening the vowel. Technically they're both temporal augments, but we call the first one a syllabic augment because it actually is adding a syllable to the verb. And we'll see here. So here the example I give is luo is our verb. We have lu is the stem, and we're going to put the personal endings on, but because it's a consonant stem, we then add e at the beginning. So e, lu, and then whatever endings we will get. So the rules then of how vowels lengthen then apply when you are creating a temporal augment by lengthening the vowels. So alphas become etas, epsilons become etas or epsilon iotas. Iota, short iota becomes long iota, omicron becomes omega, short upsilon becomes long upsilon. Alpha iota becomes eta iota subscript. Epsilon iota diphthong becomes eta iota subscript. Au diphthong becomes au diphthong, eta upsilon. And oi becomes omega iota subscript. Now, if the vowel is already long, then it stays the same. So this could also be the case for alpha, eta, and omega, that if the vowel at the beginning is long already, so if it's a long alpha, a long eta, or long omega, which these are long vowels, then they will not change. So then you have to rely on the context whenever it's in that ambiguous scenario. And you'll see in a minute why there are these potential ambiguous scenarios. Okay. Now, what are the endings that we're going to put on? Well, omega verbs, of course, have their own secondary personal endings, past tense endings, and mi-verbs have theirs. But again, they're not that different, right? So the omega verbs endings are on, es, with new movable, amen, eta, on. And the mi-verbs, have nu, sigma, nothing, men, te, sun. All right, so the endings are pretty much the same if you really think about it. The omega verbs have a vowel before the ending, and the mi-verbs just go directly onto the stem. And the only real difference is the plural, as we saw before, the on versus san. Okay, so let's see what happens. Now, in a side-by-side with the primary endings, that is the present tense time-wise endings, and the secondary endings, you can see that the similarities again, right? So primary endings, omega and mi, are what distinguish the two conjugations. And then you have, in the second person, it's ace versus sigma, a versus c, amen versus men, ete versus te, usi versus asi. So that's primary. And then in the secondary, we have on versus nu, es versus sigma, with movable nu versus nothing, amen, men, te, ete, te, on, san. Okay, so those are the endings. Now let's see how that works in terms of actually conjugating the verbs. All right, so with deiknumi, we have a syllabic augment and a pretty well-behaved verb. We're going to put the mi-verb endings on, and everything's going to go real smooth. So we have your syllabic augment. We have our stem, which comes from the pattern of the first person, me, and the infinitive there. So we just knock off these, and then you get your stem. And then you add your ending. So, deik nun, deik nus, deik nu, deik numen, deik nute, deik nu san. So you can see here, histemi is another fairly well-behaved verb. In fact, with luo, histemi is one of the few verbs that has all its principal parts and behaves regularly. So histemi, then we have histain, histes, histe, histamen, histate, histasi. Right? So we're doing what we did with the present, getting our stem in the same way, and then we're putting the new endings on, and we're creating a temporal augment by lengthening that vowel. So I guess you would just pronounce the iota at the beginning a little bit longer. So histemi, histain, histacy, histay. So long e. So he stay, he stains, he stain, something like that. Now tithemi and didomi and hiemi are gonna be a little bit tricky because what they do is they swap in some of the omega verb endings into their system. And they have the stem that comes from strictly from the infinitive all the way down after the first person. So let's see what that looks like. So here we have the breakdown. So you have your temporal augment, the and then you have your stem. First person is like the first person in the present. So you knock off the me and you get your tithe, and then you put your ending tithane. But then all the other forms after that come from the infinitive, tithe. All right. And then we also notice that in the second person and third person, in addition to coming from the infinitive, they also add the omega endings, right? Remember, the omega endings are on es, amen, ete, on. Whereas here, we can see that in second person singular and third person singular, they seem to be doing that because what you end up with is an ending that looks like a contraction of that, right? Epsilon plus epsilon gives you epsilon iota, right? And so that seems to be what's happening there. Etithes. And notice because the accent was not on any of the two vowels, you don't get a contraction. You don't get the circumflex to indicate the contraction. All right, so we get tithe, tithe, so tithane, etithane, etithes, etithe, etithemen, etithete, etithesan. Okay, etithesan. All right, so let's look at hiemi. Same thing happens. We knock off the me, we get our hie, and so it becomes hien. But then the second person singular and third person singular are coming off of the infinitive, as everything else will. So hie. And then the endings are actually, again, the endings for the omega verbs, ace, So that's why it's hien, hies, hie, hiemen, hiete, hiesan. Okay. And again, didomi, same thing. Only that didomi, just everything comes from the infinitive. The stem is going to come from the infinitive entirely. So, augment, then did, do, omicron, not omega. And then it clearly seems to be putting on the omega endings on as because then we're getting didun, which would be omicron plus omicron gives you omicron upsilon. Did do as well, omicron plus epsilon gives you omicron upsilon. Did do again, omicron plus epsilon gives you omicron upsilon. So with didomi, what we're getting is we're using the infinitive entirely as the stem, and then we are in the singular, we are actually putting the endings of the omega verbs onto it. All right, so you might just move didomi over into, when you're memorizing, you just move it over into thinking about it as an omega verb in that way. Okay, so let's look at an omega verb, luo. Augment, because it's a consonant stem, so luo, luso, elusa, eluthane. So as I said, you could use that principal part, the third and fourth principal part, to tell you that what the augment situation will be. We usually consonants is pretty straightforward. You're just gonna stick an epsilon in front. All right, so we get eluon, eluez, elue, eluamen, eluete, eluon. Now you can see that if you didn't have the augment and you had elue, eluamen, and eluete, it could be confusing, right? Because you can't. They have the endings would be exactly the same. Even the accent would be the same, so it would be hard to distinguish, and that's why in this case you definitely need the augment. Now here's a vowel contraction, a vowel vowel verb, and therefore it goes with a temporal augment. So you're going to lengthen the vowel, and again you can use that third principal part with ago, agagon, to tell you, okay, the alpha is going to probably turn into an eta safely. So agon, and then the accent changes because it's a long short, right? Long short rule, eta, and then omicron, long short. So you're getting a circumflex on that eta. All right, so agon, agez, age, agomen, agete, agon. All right. So in general, you can more or less guess what the augment will be by using the aorist, that third principal part. It's good for verbs that may be, you might not realize, are actually prefixed verbs. So something like afiko, afikne omai here. You might be tempted to maybe augment the first alpha, right? Because it's alpha. However, if you go to the aorist, you can see that, wait a second, they didn't make it into a eta or something, right? And what they did was they lengthened the iota. So what this really is actually a prefixed. It's a verb with a prefix in front, apo in front of it, right? And so so that tells you then, okay, the imperfect is also going to be afik, right? So afik ne omai. You're just going to use the middle imperfect endings, which we're going to get to in a second. But you're, as far as the augmentation goes, the first half of it, this part of it, is going to look the same. Afik. And then kne, because it's the present stem. It's not afiko main, but afikne. Oh, so you know, it'd be afikne. Okay. So here is d is stay me. You can see that, okay, it's d estan. So iota or d estain. Here, in fact, this is the imperfect, d estain. But they're using it to a certain extent here. But this would be the imperfect ending, right? At least the endings look similar, but we'll see. This is the aorist, but it's, you just put the histemi endings on here. So the difference then would be the istemi has the iota, and you just, imperfect, you would lengthen that iota, whereas the aorist, these two aorists, they drop out the iota and put in an epsilon, right? And that's going to be a feature of this verb in the aorist. Okay. Let's look at our next point, which is precisely this question about the prefixes. So what do you do when you're augmenting verbs that have a prefix? Here's a good one. Apokteno, to kill. So apokteno, apokteneo, apektena, to kill. So we want to say he killed or I killed somebody. You know, I was killing someone in the past. Imperfect. I was, murdering him. something like that. Well, then you need apo, right? That's the preposition. And so it's a preposition is being attached to kteno, which means to kill. And so you put your syllabic augment in between the prefix and the stem, and the omicron or whatever vowel the prefix has would drop off, and you're left with just ape. So that's why apectena is the aorist, and so the imperfect is similar, apectenon, because the imperfect is going to have the same way of doing it, making the same setup here, right? And so you can use the aorist, see how it was augmented in the aorist to tell you how you would augment it in the imperfect. All right. Now, just regular run-of-the-mill. Let's go through some regular run-of-the-mill omega verbs. Again, just a reminder, the endings then for mi-verbs are nu, sigma, nothing, men, te, son. And the omega verbs are on, es, amen, ete, on. So these are the only endings that verbs in the active, in the imperfect have, right? And if anything seems straight, odd or whatever, it's because maybe a mi-verb is taking the endings from the omega verbs or vice versa. But in general, these are the only two sets of endings there are. So it's easy to tell when you see a verb and you know all the markers, it's easy to spot this is a second person or this is a third person singular. I don't know if it's an omega verb because it seems to have the same kind of endings as an omega verb, but it could be a mi verb. I don't know, but I know that this verb is a second or third person or first person plural, whatever. The endings will be clear as what's going on. All right, so let's look at ballo. Nice, mostly well-behaved verb. So again, it begins with a consonant, so we need our syllabic augment, so e. And then our stem we get from knocking off the omega, and that gives us double lambda, bal, right? On, ebalon. Right? So ebalon, ebalez, ebale, ebalomen, ebalete, ebalon. Now I want you to notice something about the principal parts of ballo. Ballo, baleo, ebalon, ebletain. I throw, I hit. So you notice that the third one, the aorist, is got the same exact endings. It starts ebalon, so it's going to follow this system. But only difference is that stem. It's not double lambda, but single lambda. So we already know how to conjugate one aorist verb so far. We've got ballo and ebalon because they're going to have the same endings. The only difference between them would be, does it have one lambda or two, right? And in terms of meaning, the difference would be continuous action in the path. He was hitting the dog with the balls constantly, right? That would be the imperfect. He hit the dog with the ball one time, aorist. So we can see those two right there. Okay, and I'll come back to this issue of, we'll start picking out some of the verbs that we can actually already do in the aorist, because once we know the imperfect endings, we can tell that they are the same. They're the same endings. Okay, let's look next. All right, here is to sing. So eido, ede somai, isa, ethane, I sing, right? And so you've got your lengthening of that vowel, alpha, to ada. Then you have your stem, aid. And then you have your endings, on, es, amen, et, on. Now, in the case of eido, especially in Arabic, you're going to collapse all these vowels because Attic doesn't like so many vowels. So following the rules of contraction, like we do with contract verbs, same rules. These rules always apply to everything. And we can see, okay, so you can have, and usually in Homer or something like that, you will get this more spelt out version. So you can have aedon or aedon, aedes or aedes, aeda or aeda, aedomen or aedomen, aedeta or aedeta, aedon, aedon. All right, so you can see you can have either one here. But again, a helper is this augment. How is it augmented in the aorist form? It's got an eta with the iota subscript. So that's sort of a tip off that, maybe it's possible that it goes both ways here. And that's something to worry about. All right. Okay, so we've done the active. Now we need to move to the middle passive because the present system has active forms and middle passive forms. And so these are the mi-verbs, right? So how do they map out into the imperfect? Same principle. You're going to have augment, you're going to have stem, and you're going to have secondary endings. So let's learn what the secondary endings are. All right, so our primary endings, my, psi. So these are for mi-verbs. My, psi, tai, metha, st, entai. And these are going to turn to main, so, ta, metha, st, nto. So you can see, again, they're kind of similar, only that certainly in the second person plural and first person plural, they're the same. Metha, metha. And the third person singular and third person plural, you're instead of tai, you're getting ta. Ntai, you're getting ta. So these are the secondary endings. So let's look at tithemi then. All right, and now in the mi-verbs as they do in the active, so they do in the middle passive. They have their stem is straight from the infinitive now. We don't worry about the me form. So it's all going to have that epsilon or whatever the short vowel is. So here we have tithemi. So in the middle active or in the middle passive, it was tithemi, and so it becomes et tithemein, tithesai, et titheso, tithetai, et titheta, tithemetha, et tithemetha, tithesta, et tithesta, tithentai, et tithenta. Okay. Hiemi. So in the present, it's hiemai, hiesai, hietai, hiemetha, hiestha, hientai. And in the imperfect, it's hiemein, hieso, hieta, hiemetha, hiestha, and hiento. And histemi, histamai, histasai, histatai, histametha, histasta, histantai, histamain, histaso, histato, histametha, histasta, histanto. And then you have didomi, so didomai, didosai, didotai, didometha, didosta, didontai. Then becomes edidomain, edidoso, edidoto, edidometha, edidosta, edidonto. Okay. Dek nu mi, same thing. Dek nu mai, dek nu sai, dek nu tai, dek numitha, dek nusta, dek nuntai in the present. And then in the imperfect, dek nu main, dek nu so, dek nu to, dek numitha, dek nusta, dek nunto. And if we move to omega verbs, right? So buluo is buluo mai. And so then it becomes buluo main, bulue or bulue, depending on which one. But then bulu, bulueto from buluetai, buluometha from buluometha, buluometha, buluesta from buluesta, and buluonto from buluontai. Okay, so these are how the endings work. So then I'm now going to encourage you to do some of the exercises that will help you figure out how to, or at least help you memorize some of these forms.